You saw the headline, but you probably didn't see the real story hiding underneath it. On the surface, this was presented as escalation, a decisive moment in a long, simmering confrontation between Washington and Caracas. Another hard line, another warning, delivered in familiar language about security, stability, and consequences. The official version was clear enough to fit inside a single news cycle. The United States acted to deter a hostile regime, to reassert credibility, to draw a line that had supposedly been crossed. The strike, we were told, was limited, calculated, necessary, a response, not an initiation. But that version of the story depends on a very careful narrowing of context. It requires the audience to accept that this moment began just days earlier with a provocation that could be isolated, explained, and answered in kind. It asks us to believe that the escalation exists only on the surface as a matter of rhetoric and force, rather than as the visible expression of a much older and much deeper structure. And it quietly assumes that what matters most is the spectacle of action, not the architecture that made that action inevitable. Because when you step back, the first thing that becomes uncomfortable is how familiar this sequence feels. The language is different. The geography is closer. The ideological labels have shifted slightly with time, but the logic is the same. A regional crisis is framed as a singular threat. A domestic political moment demands clarity and strength. Ambiguity becomes politically dangerous. Restraint becomes indistinguishable from weakness. And so escalation is not debated as a choice, but performed as a necessity. The official explanation also relies on another silence. It avoids any serious discussion of timing, not the clock time of the strike itself, but the political time in which it occurred. This was not a vacuum. It unfolded inside a moment of economic strain, of global realignment, of domestic polarization that had already narrowed the range of acceptable policy responses. In that environment, Venezuela was not just a foreign policy problem, it was a stage on which broader anxieties could be acted out with relative safety, because the costs, at least in the short term, were expected to be absorbed elsewhere. What was presented as firmness toward Caracas functioned simultaneously as reassurance to audiences far removed from Latin America. It signaled control in a world that increasingly feels unmanageable. It suggested that leverage still exists, that power can still be demonstrated cleanly, without the mess, attached consequences that accompany deeper structural reform at home. And that is where the story begins to widen. Because the strike did not simply send a message to Venezuela, it sent a message to markets, to allies, to domestic institutions, and to a political class that has learned to treat foreign escalation as a substitute for internal resolution. It reminded energy traders that volatility remains policy sensitive. It reminded regional governments that alignment still comes with expectations. And it reminded American voters that strength can be performed abroad even when consensus at home has collapsed. In that simplified framing, Venezuela is frozen in time. It is always on the brink, always. Irrational. Always one step away from collapse or aggression. What disappears is the long arc of structural dependency that shaped the country's position long before the current crisis. Decades of commodity dependence, financial isolation, sanctions regimes layered on top of institutional decay, and a global energy system that rewards volatility while punishing stability. All fade into the background. The country becomes a stage, not a system. This matters because escalation does not occur in abstraction. It occurs inside incentives. And the incentives surrounding Venezuela have been quietly shifting for years. As global energy markets fragment and geopolitical blocks harden, the tolerance for ambiguity narrows. Countries that sit uncomfortably between systems, neither fully integrated nor fully isolated, become liabilities. They introduce uncertainty into supply chains, into diplomatic alignments, into pricing expectations. From a purely structural perspective, pressure is not an anomaly. It is the default response. The strike, then, was not simply a reaction to a provocation. It was a correction, an attempt to reduce ambiguity by forcing alignment or submission. And this is where the narrative becomes more unsettling, because corrections of this kind are rarely about the stated target alone. They are about signaling discipline to the entire system. Latin America has spent the past decade navigating an increasingly narrow corridor of acceptable autonomy. Trade diversification is tolerated until it threatens established leverage. Political experimentation is acceptable until it disrupts capital flows, energy. Sovereignty is encouraged rhetorically, but constrained materially. Within that context, Venezuela represents not just defiance, but unpredictability. And unpredictability is far more threatening to systems of power than ideological opposition. This helps explain why regional reactions were so carefully calibrated. Public statements emphasized concern, stability, dialogue privately. Governments weighed exposure. They assessed currency risk, migrant flows, and investment sensitivity. None of them wanted escalation, but few were willing to meaningfully oppose it. Silence, in this case, was not agreement. It was self-preservation. Media coverage mirrored this restraint. The story was framed narrowly, often technically. What was hit, when, how precise. The larger question why escalation has become such an attractive tool in moments of systemic stress was left mostly unasked. To ask it would require acknowledging that the instability being addressed is not regional but global, and that the tools being used are designed less to resolve it than to manage its perception. Meanwhile, the economic effects began to ripple outward, largely unnoticed by the audiences for whom the strike was ostensibly performed. Energy insurance premiums rose. Informal trade routes tightened. Migrant remittance channels became more precarious. These are not headline effects. They are background degradations, the kind that accumulate quietly until they define the lived reality of entire populations. And here the imbalance of risk becomes impossible to ignore. The political benefits of escalation are immediate and concentrated. The economic costs are delayed and diffuse. They fall on workers, on border communities, on fragile institutions already operating at the edge of capacity. The system absorbs the shock by pushing it downward, where it becomes harder to trace and easier to dismiss. This raises an uncomfortable question that lingers beneath the official calm. If escalation functions so efficiently as a political tool precisely because its consequences are structurally invisible, what incentive exists to ever choose a different path? The deeper logic of escalation becomes clearer when you stop treating it as a response and begin seeing it as a method of governance. In a political environment where long-term planning has been crowded out by perpetual crisis management, decisive external action offers something rare: narrative clarity. It compresses complexity into a single event, a single decision, a single frame that can be defended without reopening unresolved domestic contradictions. For the Trump administration, Venezuela occupied a uniquely convenient position inside this framework. It was geographically close, symbolically charged, and structurally weakened in ways that made retaliation appear containable, unlike conflicts that risk direct entanglement. With peer competitors, this escalation could be framed as controlled, almost procedural. It allowed strength to be demonstrated without triggering the kinds of cascading obligations that more symmetrical confrontations would invite. The danger here is not that escalation fails dramatically, but that it succeeds too modestly. that it continues to function just well enough to justify itself while quietly eroding the conditions that made it effective in the first place. This is the paradox of control in complex actions that stabilize the surface can destabilize the structure beneath. Meanwhile, domestic audiences are offered continuity. Strength is reaffirmed. Authority faker appears intact. The absence of visible backlash is read as validation, but absence is not evidence. It is delay. And delays in systems of this scale tend to compound rather than resolve. What is rarely confronted is the possibility that escalation has become self-referential, that it no longer responds primarily to external threats, but to internal demands for coherence in a fragmented political environment. In that configuration, foreign action is less about shaping outcomes abroad and more about sustaining narratives at home. If that is the case, then Venezuela is not the end of the story. It is a signal of how the system behaves when structural repair feels politically unattainable. And signals, once sent, invite interpretation. They are read, decoded, and acted upon by others who are watching closely, even if they are not speaking. The unresolved tension now pressing closer is this. When escalation becomes a habit rather than a strategy, how does a system distinguish between the appearance of control and the reality of diminishing influence before the difference becomes impossible to manage? That difference is hardest to see precisely because the system has trained itself not to look for it. Influence, once established, becomes an assumption rather than a variable. It is embedded in planning models, in diplomatic language, in the reflexive belief that signals will continue to be received and interpreted as intended. When that assumption begins to fail, it does so quietly at the margins, where anomalies can be explained away rather than confronted. The escalation in Venezuela fits neatly into this pattern. It was executed with confidence, narrated with certainty, and absorbed by institutions that have grown accustomed to treating intervention as maintenance rather than disruption. There was no sense of rupture, no acknowledgement that this moment might mark not an assertion of control, but a test of how much remains. The system moved on quickly, as it has learned to do. Yet beneath that movement lies a growing misalignment between action and outcome. Escalation still produces motion, but less direction. It still generates response, but not necessarily compliance. And the longer this gap persists, the more the system relies on repetition to compensate for fading effect. Each action must be slightly stronger, slightly clearer, slightly more visible, not because the threat has grown, but because the signal has weakened. This is where the risk becomes structural. Systems that mistake repetition for effectiveness tend to accelerate rather than pause. They interpret resistance as confirmation of necessity. They read adaptation as defiance, and in doing so, they narrow their own field of vision, mistaking complexity for obstruction rather than information. In Latin America, this narrowing is already being registered, not as outrage, but as recalibration. Governments speak less, hedge more, and invest in optionality rather than alignment. Economic actors plan for volatility as a constant rather than a deviation. Social systems absorb pressure without expecting resolution. None of this looks like confrontation, but none of it reinforces the leverage escalation is meant to preserve. The most unsettling aspect of the story, then, is not the strike itself, but what it reveals about the direction of policy. A system that increasingly relies on visible force to manage invisible. Fragility is one that has lost confidence in its own capacity for integration. It substitutes demonstration for durability, action for repair, And in doing so, it postpones the moment of reckoning rather than preventing it. The headline suggested a decisive act that shook a region. The deeper story is quieter and more uncomfortable. It is about a system testing its own limits without admitting that it is doing so, about power that still moves but no longer knows how much it weighs, about escalation that feels necessary, not because it works, but because the alternatives would require confronting structural weaknesses that have been deferred for too long. And that leaves the story where it began, without resolution. Not with an answer, but with a question the system has learned to avoid when influence depends increasingly on escalation to prove itself. What happens the moment escalation no longer convinces those who are watching that control still exists at all.